Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. And as many of you know, I've long been an opponent of the war on drugs, and I've spoken about the current administration's seeming desire to ramp up the war on drugs. One of the things that they've talked about doing is designating the drug cartels as terrorist organizations. So I was absolutely delighted when I read a recent article from Cato discussing the very issue, and I've got the author here with us today. He is a research fellow in foreign policy at the Cato Institute. He's also a historian of domestic opposition to U.S. foreign policy in the 20th century, post-war conservatism, and the national security state. Brandan P. Buck, welcome to the show.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
So I think I want to start right where you start in your article, and you talk about what it means to be at war. So, what does it mean for the United States to be at war?
That's a wonderful question, and there's not really a finite answer to it. I think our conception of what America is at war is defined by a particular war itself, that being the Second World War or maybe the First World War, that has a clear start and end date, right? We think about a phrase wartime. There's a great book by that title that I recommend for everyone on this topic. But the fact of the matter is, the United States has been at war for most of its history, and it wages other wars, right? Wars on poverty, the wars on drugs. But nevertheless, even though the condition of war is always in the background, there's the rhetoric of war, the language of going into combat, which can be used to leverage narrative campaigns against the American population, and therefore escalate the level of commitment in the U.S. government's various pseudo wars around the globe. And so for me, what has been troubling about this latest iteration of the war on drugs is that it's starting to combine itself with the war on terror, not just in the designation of these groups, which President Trump followed through on his campaign promise to do so, but it's in my mind, and also to my worry, to seed into the public's mind that we are in a state of war with the cartels, and also on the war of drugs. It's the concern is by using this rhetoric, they will militarize what is really a criminal problem. Much in the same way, frankly, during the war on terror, and there was some debate in the early days of the war on terror, like, what is this? Is this a war? Is this an actual proper war, or is this a criminal justice issue? And the U.S. government basically decided sort of both. Nevertheless, there was a sort of gray area between the two. But the concern now is with this rhetoric and with the label that we're moving further into it, like into a active engagement with the drug cartels in Mexico.
What exactly is a cartel? In other words, like, I know what the mafia was, for instance, and I know what a gang is. What is a cartel, and who are these cartels that they have designated, I guess, as terror organizations?
Well, there are experts who are far more versed on the minutia of the cartels in Mexico, but they are criminal organizations that in some parts of Mexico have they are in fact a de facto government. They maintain them a monopoly on force in the same way that governments do. And they've monopolized the drug trade as well as other illicit illicit traffic and other things, but primarily drugs, of course. And there's about 4 or 5 active cartels in Mexico now. The Sinaloa cartel, which was the big one, broke up. There's this CNTJ, I believe the acronym is probably the most dangerous and most militarily competent. And there's the Gulf cartel as well. But the cartels have splintered over time. This is one of the great fallacies of this argument that is being leveled in service of escalation, is that the cartels were struck pretty effectively by previous Mexican administrations. A lot of cartel leaders were killed, and that didn't do anything to stem the flow of drugs. And if anything, it made the drug trade down there more violent, because now the structures were more fractured.
So these are bad guys, right? Not because of the drug. I mean, they're murderers. They're very violent. Nothing that's not in dispute.
No, I think that's pretty clear. I mean, much in the same way that Pablo Escobar was back in the 80s, arguably worse. I mean, some of the tactics that these organizations use really are terror tactics. I don't think that is in dispute. The question is what do you do about that? And there are two problems, right? There is the drug problem that obviously leads to overdose issues here in the United States, but there is a criminal justice, law and order problem that has bled over the border and into the United States. How you deal with those, should be independent, right? I mean, at least from a libertarian perspective. But trying to address either of them by assertively, using American military power in Mexico would just absolutely make things worse.
When did people in the Trump orbit start talking about this as a policy? And I have two separate questions in relation to that. One is, what is the claimed reasoning behind it? In other words, what is the pitch that they make? And is there a separate reason that they really want to do it? I know that calls for speculation. I got it, but that's what I want you to do. If you don't want to, that's fine.
Well, but 2023 is when there started to be a consistent call for this change in policy. Of course, Trump was out of office, but nevertheless, folks in Congress, including the current National Security Advisor, Waltz, and also Dan Crenshaw, put forth a AUMF as authorization for use of military force in order to begin to use military assets to target the cartels. The problem with that authorization is like all authorizations for use of military force, it was so nebulous in its wording that you could read into it just about any targeting authority over to the president. So 2023 is when it really started to gain traction within conservative circles. And so what is the stated goal? Well, I mean, there is this belief that through the use of force, however defined, it often, one of the problems with this argument is that folks like it's almost like a Mott and Bailey, right? Crenshaw will say, well, we're not trying to initiate unilateral force. We're trying to issue partnered force, but maybe if we might have to use, but then you have hardliners like Waltz and also Tom Homan, who's the border czar, come out and say, no, we want to use special operations forces kinetically in Mexico. So it's sort of, pick your narrative. I think one of the problems is if you do go with a sort of with a moderate stance on this, you're going to leave the door open for further escalation. And as far as what they have envisioned, I mean, the folks who profit this typically cite the war against ISIS as a model which they believe to be exportable to Mexico. Now, I'm old enough to remember the war on ISIS. That was not a low footprint special operations campaign, right? That was a low scale war, which had large proxy forces and folks like the Kurds, as well as thousands of air sorties dropping tens of thousands of bombs. And so that is not a model that is exportable to Mexico. The Mexican government has clearly said that they're not going to tolerate unilateral military action. So, I mean, I would hope that the Trump administration knows this. The question is if this escalates, will they try a surreptitious use of military force, using special operation forces unilaterally and unsupported? And if that happens, then you might find, and the U.S. government would put itself in a position of being overexposed, in my opinion, against pretty competent forces, certainly sizable ones, in the cartels.
The war on drugs, in my view, and I think in any honest person's view, has been an abominable failure. Not only is it a failure, but it leads to many of the problems that its advocates say that they're fighting, much as with government intervention in the economy is, trying to alleviate poverty, raise minimum wage, whatever. When you outlaw drugs, you of course make them more expensive, and you open the door for organizations like the cartels, who are largely a creation of this war on drugs. So from my view, I can't imagine how ramping up or exacerbating this war could possibly help. What do you think will be the practical effects if we actually do? I mean, it's a designation, but if it actually escalates into bombing or U.S. troops or anything like that?
Well, like I said, hopefully we never get there. But there are a lot of American-owned businesses in Mexico. There are, of course, a lot of American citizens in Mexico. All of them would be pretty sizable targets for retaliation in Mexico. And the Mexican, I mean, sorry, the Mexican cartels are not slouches. I mean, they have gotten their noses bloodied time and again by the Mexican security forces, but nevertheless, they do have the capacity to muster a significant amount of force. I don't know if you remember when the Mexican government tried to arrest Chapo, and the cartels came out with like 750 gunmen and trucks. I mean, that's not something to sneeze at. So if the U.S. government tries to wage a war against a force of about 100,000, as I've seen some estimates, that's not nothing. That's about as large as the Taliban was during the height of the war in Afghanistan. And Mexico itself is a very large country with pretty punishing terrain and people, particularly in rural areas, that have a traditional apathy towards being governed from by outsiders. Nevertheless, the pull of Mexican nationalism, which will almost assuredly be activated should the United States start to insert itself in Mexico militarily.
It also seems to me that instead of, for instance, cutting down on overdoses, which is the claim all the time, is there's all these overdoses, that because of the iron law of prohibition, what you're going to have is they're just going to come up with more creative ways. And that often entails more lethal doses, smaller doses that they can smuggle into the country. And it also would diminish the supply, which would cause the price to go up, which would create the incentive for more illegal organizations or new ones to step into the equation. It's not just a matter of, oh, we don't like the cartels, we have military force, we can get rid of them. On the demand side, there's a high demand for these drugs in this country. And when there's that kind of demand, somebody, it seems, is going to meet it. So it's not likely, I don't think, and that's what I want you to tell me, it's not likely to achieve the goals that they say they want to achieve. Do you think that's accurate?
Well, not in the long term. I mean, the federal government's own data has shown a decrease of fentanyl interdictions into the country. Is that because they're now taking them via like sea routes, or like they haven't caught them? Like, we don't know. I mean, there has been a slight decline in fentanyl overdoses over the past few months that started before the Trump administration came into office. So whether or not that's part of a trend or not, we don't know. But one of the problems with fentanyl is it's so easy to produce, right? It's synthetic. So trying to have the same kind of strategies in like Plan Colombia, where you go torch cocoa fields or marijuana fields, is that won't apply, because even if you stem off the flow of drugs from Mexico or Canada, the chemicals are still available and can still be produced domestically. So short term, they could very well succeed, but as you say, like, the market finds a way. So that'll be filled somehow, probably domestically.
You're a historian of, it says, post-war conservatism. And William F. Buckley Jr., who was one of the founders of the modern conservative movement, toward the end of his life, he became an opponent of the war on drugs. He saw that it was a unwinnable situation. Is there any push within conservatism now, or what passes for conservatism, to stop this war on drugs and not exacerbate it? Or are they all just going to fall in line with whatever Trump says? Because it seems like there's no pushback against this guy anymore.
So just as an aside, Buckley rather famously smoked a joint on his yacht in international waters. So as far, I think the problem is that fentanyl is a particularly lethal drug, and it has impacted areas of the country that are essential to Trump's base. So I think that there is a particular view of this drug within Trump's particular voting base, which gives it such appeal. So as of right now, I don't foresee there being a internal ramping down of the war on drugs through conservatism. I mean, like the number of libertarian-leaning conservatives within the party is what, a handful, like Rand Paul and Thomas Massey. And frankly, I'm not really sure what their views on the cartels are. It's probably not as hardline libertarian as either of us would like. So I think, unfortunately, there's probably we're going to be in a little bit of a ramp up on the war on drugs. The question is trying to control that ramp up to this side of the border rather than have it go cross border. At least that's my current intellectual objective.
Much of politics is communication, right? It's the way you shape an argument or formulate an argument to have the biggest push. When George W. Bush says you're either for us or against us, and he designates the axis of evil, or when Trump goes out there and fake news, these are designed to persuade and influence. So when they use terms like the cartels are terror organizations, it reminds me of saying that immigrants are invaders. You're using language of war to describe things that aren't normally seen as acts of war. An invasion, traditionally, it has been, for instance, another army representing a government of another country coming into the country. It's not just people coming here that you happen to not like, or even if they were horrible people, it's still not an invasion. And terror organizations are usually defined as an organization that resorts to violence for political ends, and they pretty indiscriminate. They'll target civilians to create chaos, that sort of thing. But the cartels aren't like trying to knock out the American government or create instability. They're trying to profit off illicit drug use. Are there any parallels in U.S. history to sort of the altering of language to make it seem like we were on a war footing when we really are not? And what were the results then? In other words, what lessons can we learn from the past that can be applied to this current situation?
Well, I mean, as far as non-state actors think like prohibition, I can't think of a comparable example. But something that you can make the argument that this is the kind of rhetorical incrementalism that you see in wars against other states, trying to play with the idea of when does a condition of war actually exist, and therefore what powers can you use against those who might oppose that incrementalism. I mean, there's an example of this right now with the war in Ukraine, right? Like, are we at war with Russia or not? And it just depends upon who you talk to and what their definition of war is. Nevertheless, saying that we are in a state of war, it gives people the license to crack down on people who oppose it through various wartime-like measures, right? Censorship, soft censorship, controlling information. So with the organizations, with the cartels in Mexico, that there is a similar fear, right? Like, we know that there is we know that there is a overdose problem. We know that there is a criminal problem. This criminal problem, it has terror-like tactics, we could say, I think pretty fairly. But by moving the Overton window and putting those into the same bucket as a group like ISIS or Al Qaeda, or even groups from decades past like the IRA, or people who use terror for the purposes of politics, you're creating the permission structures to now view this new group, which is the cartels, same as you would groups like ISIS or Al Qaeda. I mean, I'm old enough to remember 9/11, right? Flying planes in a building, that's terrorism. Using murder and intimidation in a criminal fashion is something that criminal organizations have done, throughout time. I mean, think about some of the worst massacres during the war, during Prohibition, right? St. Valentine's Day. Do we consider that terrorism? Of course not. But because it is now useful for the regime in this way, they're going to use it.
Is that why you mentioned in the title of your article, the cognitive shift?
Right.
Right. just explain a little bit. I mean, you kind of just did, but a little bit more in depth what exactly that means, because I think that's vital. The idea that there's this cognitive shift within the minds of the people of this country.
So, if I could, I'd like to crib on some work that I've done
Sure.
in a different aspect. So, the Second World War, I wrote a piece for the Libertarian Institute on what's sometimes called the First Brown Scare. In this case, it was the FBI's surveillance of the America First Committee, which was all done illegally. They got volunteers to go out and basically infiltrate local America First chapters, much like they would with the communist groups in the 50s, trying to get derogatory information or trying to find these secret Nazi spy rings, which didn't exist. But nevertheless, the United States in 1941 was, until December 7th, 1941, was not in a state of war. But nevertheless, the rhetoric of war allowed individual citizens to begin to view the people in their communities who might have opposed further escalation into the war as being enemy agents, even if they weren't. And it creates this. We often hear the phrase adjacency, right? It's like you have the actual threat in this case, which is Germany way over there. You have people in government who want further involvement into the war, and you have those that oppose it. And so, even though you're not in a state of war, as long as you use the language of wartime rhetoric, preparedness, fifth column. This is a phrase that was inserted into the lexicon. Then you can afford the state, or in this case, individual citizens, to deputize themselves essentially as spy watchers, and this helps to create this fear of a foreign enemy. In this case, Nazi Germany, which largely didn't exist in terms of actual material spies and saboteurs and those kinds of things. So with this, the fear is that there could be a similar type of dynamic at play. That once we start to think about criminal organizations as terror groups, it will afford the government greater powers to deal with them, but also it will give individual citizens carte blanche to begin to draft themselves as spies, or spy watchers, those kinds of things.
Where do you see this going, given our current political atmosphere, given the entire context? How do you think this turns out? I know obviously you can't know for sure, but you are a historian. So where exactly do you see this going?
Well, I hate to be elusive, but it's tough to say. I mean, in the past, obviously we could think of like Pancho Villa as being a instance in which the U.S. government went full bore to go after Pancho Villa. But then again, that was in the context of a full-blown civil war in Mexico. So that doesn't quite apply here. And then, and in administrations after that, there had been opportunities to intervene in Mexico, particularly under the Coolidge administration, in which the U.S. government didn't. Right now we're seeing fairly unprecedented deployment of military assets, particularly on the water, U.S. naval assets. Which is unusual. There have been reports of U.S. UAVs or drones flying in Mexico. Whether or not they're being flown with the permission of the Mexican government, we don't know. We do know in the past, however, that intelligence gathering assets like UAVs have been flown in Mexico with the permission and collaboration of the Mexican government. So that's a pretty big departure if they're not being flown with permission. The question is also, what are they doing with those? Are they trying to prep the ground for military incursions into Mexico, or are they trying to support a ramped up border mission by trying to interdict drugs or people smugglers, those kinds of things? We don't know. But knowing that, what their mission is would give a pretty big indication of where we're headed. Hopefully, it's not trying to pave the ground for some kind of incursion.
Well, while I have you here, I might as well ask a historian, a foreign policy expert, about the current situation. Aside from this issue, is there anything else that really stands out to you that people should be paying attention to in regards to foreign policy, and why?
Well, certainly what's happening in, just pick one, right? I mean, right now, my big concern is the Middle East, and particularly it's the internal dynamics of the Trump administration. So I haven't yet read the story in the Atlantic, but I've seen enough commentary on it I mean, for people observing from the outside, trying to get a better view on who has Trump's ear. I think in the past, uh, basically he's listened to the person he spoke to last, right? And sometimes that's worked out well for libertarians. I believe it's pretty well reported and true that during the last administration, it was Rand Paul who really convinced him to try to get troops out of Syria. Of course, that failed. He was undermined by members of his own administration. So seeing those dynamics now in the Middle East is certainly something to watch. And is this latest round of bombing against the Houthis, is this an element of his maximum pressure campaign to try to get some coercion with Iran, or is it prepping the ground for further direct action against Iran? I think it's something to watch and certainly something to worry about. As if we needed more to worry about.
I've been hearing people advocate and argue against war with Iran. It seems like forever.
Yeah, I mean, for 20 years now, at least.
Yeah. Is it a smokescreen? I mean, is it just talk? I'm at the point I just don't think it would ever happen. But I also know that sometimes when you think something's never going to happen, it happens, right? Do you think there's a good chance that actually occurs?
I don't know about a good chance, but I do think there is an outside chance of some kind of bombing campaign tailored to their nuclear program, either through Israel or via the United States, in terms of like a true regime change in Iran. That's incredibly hard to imagine, particularly how great the last few have gone. And Iran is far bigger and militarily capable than either the Taliban was in Afghanistan until they got all of our equipment, or Iraq was before Saddam was toppled. I mean, the concern is that conservatism right now is fairly split on this issue. I think the youth, or the kind of Tucker Carlson crowd, that wing, the folks at the American Conservative whom I write for, are very much opposed to this and further escalation in the Red Sea. But there are some, neocon-ish, foreign policy types which are still very much in the Trump administration and still have power within the movement. So the question is, who wins? I think the best thing we can hope for is that there is some sort of compromise between these two, and hopefully, I don't know. But I think the best that we can hope for right now is Trump or people around him are believing this is an aspect towards coercing Iran into some kind of deal. So
Yeah, I'm not a dove on foreign policy by any means. I consider myself to be a foreign policy skeptic. I was a supporter of the Iraq War because it was after 9/11, and I bought the arguments, and I've learned from that just because they say something, the government, I mean, doesn't make it true, and plans often don't go as we want them to go. It's a lesson that I'm well aware of in economics of unintended consequences. I just hadn't applied it to war. But if you go to war, it isn't just, okay, yeah, we can just go take out Iran's nuclear facilities and that's it. It's over with. They get a vote on what happens also, right? And there's a lot of other people that get a vote. And there's mistakes that happen. And it's just something I think, unless it's absolutely necessary, that we really ought to avoid. And I have a lot of friends who think we absolutely should take out Iran's nuclear reactor. I just think that that's something we should be very hesitant, to say the least, about doing.
yeah, I mean, you're not going to find an argument for me on that. I mean, and you're right. I was, how old was I? I think I was 20. I was 18 on 9/11. I'm a veteran. I was in the Army. So like I remember that pretty vividly, and how quickly the war in Iraq went sideways, because you're right. It's the knowledge problem, right? This is Hayek. You can't you can't know enough to engineer a society from the top down. Nevertheless, there are people in this town, meaning DC, where I work out of, who still somehow view regime change as possible. Right? They just got one in Syria through relatively low American effort. It took 10 years, destroyed the country, and put neoliberal jihadists in Damascus. But so that's kind of my worry, is that the somewhat successful, and I use air quotes, regime change in Syria has given license to people who think they can do this now in Iran. The question is how much juice do they have in the administration, and how much of an appetite for that? Because there are voices, particularly in the vice president, who view foreign policy through his experience in Iraq, and he's been pretty explicit about that. So I think as long as the idea of regime change gets thrown into the trash, I think that's a win. Unfortunately, there are people who, in the current administration, and frankly in the Democratic Party and the establishment generally, who still believe that the United States should be a arbiter of power, right? Be it in the Middle East or in Europe or in East Asia. And that's going to be a tougher ideological fight to win.
So, Brandon, where can people find you?
If you're on X, you shouldn't be, but I am.
Yeah, it's a dumpster fire.
Yeah, it is. But occasionally you find some good things in that dumpster before it goes up. So you can follow me at Brandon_Buck. It's Brandon with an A. You can also follow my author page on Cato, and they update all the things that I do there. So
awesome. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come and talk to us about this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Leibowitz. Until next time.